Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to our Van Gogh Around the World panel discussion. I'm Dorota Chudzicka, Assistant Curator of Modern European Art at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm a moderator for today's panel. The nature of our topic is global, and I'm pleased to say that we are joined by panelists and viewers from around the world. This panel is occasioned by Van Gogh in America exhibition organized by the Detroit Institute of Arts and on view until January 22nd. So there are still a couple of weeks left to see the exhibition for those who can come to Detroit. The exhibition identifies the reception of Vincent van Gogh and the market for his work as a subject of particular importance and scholarly interest. It chronicles the considerable efforts made by early promoters of modernism in the United States, dealers, collectors, public institutions, private art organizations, and the Van Gogh family to introduce Van Gogh's biography and his artistic production in this country. Van Gogh in America is part of the Bonnie Ann Larson Modern European Artists series here at the DIA. We are incredibly grateful to all of the sponsors listed here on the screen. Without their generous support, this exhibition would not have been possible. So thank you. I would like to welcome our panelists, whose scholarship deeply enriched our knowledge on the subject of the reception of Vincent van Gogh in Europe, the United States, and Asia, and revealed how impactful Van Gogh's body of work and his artistic persona have been for societies and cultures worldwide. Each panelist will deliver 15-minute remarks. I will introduce each speaker at their turn. After the presentation, the panelists will respond to questions, which can be submitted during the panel via the comments section on YouTube or Facebook. One would need to be registered on either of these platforms in order to leave a question. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Bregje Gerritse. Bregje Gerritse is researcher at the Van Gogh Museum. She is the curator of the forthcoming exhibition, Van Gogh Along the Seine, organized in collaboration with the Art Institute of Chicago for 2023-2024. In 2021, she curated the exhibition The Potato Eaters, Mistake or Masterpiece. She assisted at several exhibition projects, including On the Verge of Insanity in 2016 and Van Gogh in Japan in 2018. She is one of the authors of the forthcoming Van Gogh Museum Collection Catalog, Vincent van Gogh, Paintings, Arles, Saint-Remy, and Auvers. She completed a master's degree in museology at the École du Louvre in Paris and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. Her research topic is the reception of Vincent van Gogh in Paris, 1886-1914, art dealers, collectors, critics, and contemporary artists. Welcome, Bregje.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction, and thank you so much for having me. May we go to the next slide, please? So Dorota very kindly introduced the topic of my PhD, and I'm not at all finished yet, and we have quite limited time today. So I thought it would be interesting to focus on the very beginnings of Van Gogh's artistic reputation, which happened in France, as I'm sure others today will focus more on things that happened during the 20th century. I will focus on the very first few years after his death. Next slide, please. After just 3 months in his beautiful newfound environment of Auvers-sur-Oise, Van Gogh succumbed to the effects of his suicide attempt on the 29th of July, 1890. And during the last months of his life, it seemed to Van Gogh that as a painter, he was, and I quote, a failure. I feel that that's the fate I'm accepting and which won't change anymore. In reality, this was not the case. Next slide, please. he'd already received recognition from his peers. The Dutchman, by that time, had gathered an important circle of colleagues, friends, and admirers, and no fewer than 50 letters of condolence were received by his brother Theo and the Van Gogh family, of which the majority were sent from France. 11 by artists, including such names as Monet, Pissarro, Toulouse-Lautrec, Guillaumin, and Quost. 3 by art critics, 2 letters from collectors, and a letter from an art dealer. And Van Gogh's death did not go unnoticed by the press either. 7 short articles on the subject were published in regional and Paris newspapers. And the widely read La Petite Presse praised him as, and I quote, one of the most interesting of our Impressionist painters. And these words of appreciation demonstrate that Van Gogh already enjoyed a small but secure reputation in artistic circles at the time. It simply takes time to build a reputation, and he had been only trying to carve out a place for himself among the Parisian avant-garde since the winter of 1886-87. Next slide, please. When we look prior to 1888, Van Gogh's art could be seen, for instance, at his brother Theo's apartment and the shop run by the paint seller Julien Tanguy. And 1888 was also the year that he first participated in an official group exhibition, the Salon des Indépendants, and he immediately caught the eye of like-minded painters and commentators. The critic Gustave Kahn, for instance, next slide please, wrote that, and I quote, "Mr. Van Gogh paints large landscapes vigorously and with little concern for the value or precision of his tones." And he also took part in the 1889 and 1890 exhibitions of the Indépendants, drawing, and this is very interesting, by far the most press coverage of any of the foreign exhibitors. Next slide, please. The breakthrough in the French press really came in January 1890 when the poet and critic Albert Aurier wrote his article Les Isolés Vincent van Gogh. And Aurier certainly touched a nerve because he wrote that Van Gogh was a great painter and a terrible and desperate genius, but he will only ever be fully understood by his brothers, the most artistic of artists, and by a very few fortunate members of the common people. Next slide, please. That same month, Van Gogh took part in the annual exhibition of the Artists Association Les Vins, which was the Brussels equivalent of the Indépendant, and the exhibition resulted in the first substantial sale of his work. The Belgian painter Anna Boch purchased his Red Vineyard at Les Vins for no less than 400 francs. So, as far as others were concerned, Van Gogh was by no means a failure, and several critics had already spotted him as an exceptional artist with an entirely personal style. His reputation, therefore, was growing within a small yet important circle, and as we will later see, not only in France. Now, let's take a look at what happened after he passed away. Next slide, please. After Vincent committed suicide, his brother Theo, stricken with grief at Vincent's death, put all his effort into bringing his late brother's work to the attention of dealers and art critics to steadily build his reputation. So he began by making plans just a few days after the funeral for what he called an Exposition Vincent, which was a large-scale exhibition in a rented space where people would be able to see numerous works together in order to attract the attention of the press. Theo approached dealer Paul Durand-Ruel to explore the possibilities for an event of this kind at his gallery on Rue Lafitte. The dealer came to Theo's home in the week of August 19th to view Vincent's work, but he hesitated. And Theo also invited the art critic Aurier to come and dine with him and his wife Jo at the beginning of September, on which occasion they discussed the possibility of Aurier writing a biography. Theo, at this moment, decided to lend his brother's letters from Saint-Rémy to the writer in preparation of this biography. And this will also been the moment, no doubt, I think, when Aurier acquired most of his collection of Van Gogh paintings. He owned 12, and it's highly plausible that he received many of these works from Theo as an advance or as a thank you for his assistance. Around the same time, the critic Julien Leclerc published a brief obituary of Van Gogh in the Mercure de France, and I quote, "He will perhaps have his due hour of fame before being ranked among the rare, bold, and personal artists of this fin de siècle." Leclerc also announced in his article that there was to be an exhibition of the painter's most important works, which indicates that he was aware of Theo's plans. In the end, Durand-Ruel did not go ahead with a solo exhibition of Van Gogh, so Theo decided to set it up in his own new apartment, which was still vacant, and that served as an exhibition space from the 22nd of September. According to his friend and fellow artist Émile Bernard, the apartment walls were hung so full of paintings that the various rooms looked like galleries in an art museum. And it was also Bernard who helped install the works. And Theo and Bernard respected Vincent's ideas about exhibiting art by placing paintings side by side with others that intensified their colors. So this exhibition enjoyed a certain success. Theo managed to sell 2 works to Emile Schuffenecker, a close acquaintance of Vincent and Theo, and Tanguy was also able to sell 2 paintings a few months later. So works by Van Gogh were on constant display at his modest paint shop at the time, so Tanguy's paint shop, and Aurier repeatedly pointed this out to the readers of his monthly column in the Mercure de France. So it all seemed to be going quite well up until this point, but then something happened. Next slide, please. Theo continued to search for an official venue for the Exposition Vincent, but he himself started to show the first signs of a severe nervous breakdown. He collapsed on the 9th of October and was hospitalized and eventually transferred to a clinic in Utrecht. Bernard, however, did not give up, even though that the most important representative of Vincent's artistic legacy, Theo, was no longer there. So in December 1890, he arranged for 3 Van Gogh paintings from Aurier's collection to be included in the group exhibition Peintres Impressionnistes et Symbolistes at the Barque de Bouteville Art Gallery. Theo died on the 25th of January 1891, 6 months after his brother. Not only was Jo, his wife, now a single parent responsible for a child less than a year old, but she also had to take charge of Theo's own collection and of Vincent's paintings. She swiftly understood that this was not merely a physical legacy, but required her to continue the brothers' shared mission to build Vincent's reputation as a painter. So Bernard, having failed to get Aurier to write about Van Gogh, himself decided to publish 2 texts about his friend in 1891, one in Les Hommes d'Aujourd'hui and another in La Plume. And at the beginning of March of that year, he and a group of friends continued the effort to get the Exposition Vincent off the ground, because they still considered they needed a real official venue instead of the apartment of Theo's. So he wrote, "All the friends will get to work. Schuffenecker, Fauché, Daniel, Denis, Tanguy, Redon, and I. In the press, it will be Huysmans and Mirbeau." So he asked Jo, who had moved back to the Netherlands, to leave Van Gogh's works in Paris a while longer and to not lend them to another, in his view, rival exhibition. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, he was unable to find a venue, and Jo, contrary to his request, submitted 10 works to the Salon des Indépendants, which opened on the 20th of March. Next slide, please. And this really turned out to be a sound strategic move on Jo's part. Van Gogh's works was mentioned in at least 6 articles. Next slide, please. Including an extensive piece on the front page of L'Écho de Paris, and I quote, "It is immensely sad to think that this painter, so magnificently talented that this artist, so thrilling, so instinctive, so visionary, is no more. The collection of paintings in the apartment in Paris were relocated to Jo's new Dutch address in April, and plans for a major retrospective exhibition in Paris were now shelved for the time being. Next slide, please. While 4 exhibitions were devoted to Van Gogh in the Netherlands, in the course of the following year, Bernard finally managed to organize a modest solo presentation in Paris of works still in France. 16 works were exhibited at the Barque de Bouteville Gallery in April 1892, including a version of La Berceuse, which belonged to Bernard. Next slide, please. And the critic at La Vie Moderne was enthusiastic. Van Gogh was inspired, he wrote, and he praised not only the paintings, but the drawings too. And I quote, "Let anyone who mocks him go to Le Barque. They will be forced to admit that many a serious artist would be incapable of producing in pen and ink landscapes like the ones exhibited there." Unfortunately, Ourier suddenly died in October from an infection, and while he had studied Van Gogh and seemed the ideal person to write his biography, the publication never got off the ground. Next slide, please. Bernard had meanwhile conceived of the idea of publishing Van Gogh's letters. Early 1893, he managed to present a series of them in the Mercure de France, the literary magazine that I've mentioned a few times, complete with illustrations and reproductions of letter sketches and a self-portrait of Van Gogh that you all see here. Jo's brother paid for the reproductions, and Bernard wrote an article to introduce the letters, and the series continued until August 1897. Next slide, please. As far as I'm aware, no Van Gogh exhibitions were held in Paris in 1893 or 1894. Only at Le Barque de Bouteville was a work of his on display, the self-portrait with bandaged ear. Next slide, please. Which was included in the exhibition Les Portraits du Prochain Siècle, Portraits of the Next Century. And it resulted in a publication where Van Gogh's portrait was reproduced alongside Rodin's and Cézanne's, as you can see on the screen. Next slide, please. When Tanguy died in 1894 after a short illness, the location in Paris where Van Gogh's work had been continuously on display also disappeared. And following Tanguy's death, it was the art dealer Ambroise Vollard who picked up the baton, organizing his first Van Gogh exhibition in 1895. While this did not result in any sales, it did elicit a ringing endorsement in La Revue Blanche, which cited, and I quote, "those famous sunflowers so colorful and unaffected." From that moment on until the early 20th century, Vollard became the leading dealer for Van Gogh's work in Paris. So in conclusion, next slide, please. Van Gogh died at the very moment that after 10 years as an artist, interest in his work had started to grow and he was beginning to receive recognition in artistic circles. Theo committed himself to building this reputation further. As fate would have it, though, he and several others of Vincent's advocates would all die in the space of a few years. Yet despite these setbacks, Van Gogh's reputation was steadily growing in the first years after his death. Bernard, and above all Jo, saw to it that the paintings were shown at various exhibitions, which meant that the painter was still written about from time to time. Next slide. Of course, these were just the very, very early beginnings of his reputation that I've just shared with you. But nonetheless, I hope that it was interesting to take a deep dive in these first few years after his death. And I thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bregje. Our next speaker is Chris Stolwijk. Dr. Stolwijk studied political sciences and art history at the Free University in Amsterdam and at the Utrecht University, where he received his PhD in art history in 1997. After lecturing at the Utrecht University, he successfully held positions at the Van Gogh Museum as curator of research, head of research, and head of collections, presentation, and research. In November 2012, he was appointed General Director of RKD, Netherlands Institute for Art History. Since 2017, he's also professor of the long 19th century at the Utrecht University. Dr. Stolwijk has participated in various research projects, including a series of museum catalogs, the Van Gogh Letters Project, Van Gogh's Studio Practice, the Rembrandt Database, the Mondrian Edition Project, and Van Gogh Worldwide. He collaborated on many international exhibitions, including Van Gogh and Nature in 2015 and the upcoming Cézanne, Van Gogh, Le Fauconnier, and the School of Bergen, opening in the spring this year. Dr. Stolwijk has been also a contributor to the Van Gogh in America exhibition catalog. Chris, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dorota. And first of all, thank you very much also to my colleagues at the Detroit Museum Institute of Art for being able to being present at this seminar, which is about Van Gogh in and from Holland. May I have also the next slide? When Vincent van Gogh died in 1819, few people in the Netherlands had heard of him. His obscurity came to the fore in a 1996 letter from the chairman of the Rotterdamse Kunstkring, the Rotterdam Art Circle, and director of Museum Boijmans, Pieter Haverkorn van Rijswijk, to the earlier mentioned Jo van Gogh Bonger. You see her on the left below. After the death of her first husband, Theo, which is on the left above row, after the death of her first husband, Theo van Gogh, she administered the estates of both Vincent and his younger brother. In his letter, Haverkorn van Rijswijk indicated that for a choice exhibition of modern Dutch watercolors, the name of your highly esteemed son, Vincent van Gogh, has been placed on our list. The Art Circle wanted to exhibit works by Van Gogh, but the chairman wrote, "To be honest, I don't know whether Mr. Vincent van Gogh ever made any drawings in watercolor, even in the broadest sense." Each period constructs its own image of art and artist through the filter of changing socio-economic, national and institutional factors and views on art. The art-loving public came into contact with different Van Goghs at different moments in time. Sometimes he was an exponent of a modern French direction, and this as a vrai réaliste, as an impressionist or a symbolist. While at others he was a French-Dutch artist, a Dutch-French artist, a peintre hollandais, or even a Germanic expressionist from the north. However, early on he was also seen as a sick or a sickly artist, a big child, an unhappy painter, a tormented genius, or an isolé, as Aurier, an outsider, as Aurier pointed out, who had to follow his own path to die like a martyr in the struggle for modern art. Around 1900, Van Gogh's visibility was highly dependent on the often monographic presentation organized by art dealers and artist associations, and on a large group exhibitions with works by like-minded artists. Presentations by art dealers and artist associations offered the public a certain exclusivity and thus a more focused attention on unique artists, personalities, and their novel initiatives. In the wake of this, a more contemplative and appreciative art criticism developed, with specific notice being taken of an artist's work and his biography. In the case of Van Gogh, over the years, his biography became charged with the publication of parts of his hard-rendering correspondence in different languages, with varied in scope. After early publication of miscellaneous letters in specialist international art journals in the 1890s, Bregje showed us some already, the complete 3-volume edition of De Brieven aan zijn broeder, Letters to His Brother, on which Jo van Gogh had toiled for almost a quarter of a century, came out in 1914. Van Gogh only gained some recognition among a small circle of progressive artists, art critics and collectors in the late 1880s, first in Paris, then in Brussels, and as of the early 1819 also in the Netherlands. While living in France from early 1888, Van Gogh annually exhibited as a Dutch painter, un peintre hollandais, at the Société des Artistes Indépendants. Van Gogh died barely 3 months after the last successful presentation at the Indépendant in spring 1890. In the months following Van Gogh's demise, his younger brother, has already been showed, Theo, who had been the manager of the Paris branch of the influential Art de Bousseau-Valadon on Boulevard Montmartre since 1881, Theo's brother-in-law, Andries Bronger, who lived in Paris, and his artist friend, Émile Bernard, devoted themselves to the artist's legacy. Although Bronger and Bernard saw a future in France for the work of this peintre hollandais, Jo decided to bring all the works from the estate of her brother-in-law, Vincent, and her husband, Theo, to the Netherlands in early 1891. Jo's decision to transfer Van Gogh's works to the Netherlands and her activities in the following years to promote them meant that the early reception and appreciation of Van Gogh's efforts were twofold. In France, Belgium, and later Germany, there was a strong emphasis on Van Gogh's French works. These were seen as an endorsement of his contribution to the development of a modern international movement in art and painting, primarily based on French principles. In the Netherlands, on the other hand, attention was paid to the artist's Dutch roots, and an attempt was made to place the artist in a Dutch tradition of painting. In this presentation, I will mainly focus on Jo van Gogh's contribution to promote the work of her former brother-in-law. This means that the contribution of collector Helene Kröller-Müller, who bought her first works by Van Gogh already in the late 1900s, will be touched only on very briefly. Upon her return in the Netherlands, Jo van Gogh made use of a network and that of Theo, which included various artists and literary figures. In 1891-92, by means of numerous loans, she cooperated with art appreciation gatherings and exhibitions for sale of varying scope and venues, including Artists Union's Pulgri Studio in The Hague, art dealer Buffa in Amsterdam, art dealer Oldenziel in Rotterdam, the Hague Art Circle, Artie and Amicitia, an Artists Union in Amsterdam, and in Kunstzaal Panorama, Amsterdam. May I also have the next slide, please. In his review of the Buffa presentation in 1892, well-known community artist, gemeenschapskunstenaar in Dutch, Richard Roland Hoost, cautioned that Van Gogh's lonely and dramatic life could cloud a clear view of his art. Indeed, Van Gogh's curious and highly original works were at best received as the not entirely, I quote, successful expressions of a very independent artist, as reported in a newspaper, Algemeen Handelsblad. Far more frequently, however, his art was interpreted as an incomprehensible manner of doing things, due to the unfortunate painter's abnormal state of mind. Museum director David van der Kelle, for example, described Van Gogh's work as an amalgamation of the most vivid colors, juxtaposed without purpose, which no one can find beautiful. The magnificence of this work was even more pronounced in the Buffa Art Gallery. From the 1819 onwards, fine, harmonious, warm, as well as honest, sincere, not artificial, were qualifications writers on art attributed to the representatives of different generations of the Hague School, which was internationally considered as being Holland's most important contribution to contemporary art. The interests in the art of masters such as Jacob Maris, on the left, Joseph Everels in the middle, and Anton Mauve grew considerably in those years, not only in their own country, but also far beyond the borders, where the Hague School was dubbed the modern Dutch school. Their objective to depict the Dutch landscape and the daily life of farmers, fishermen, and country folk in a realistic manner was widely praised. They were said to have thereby revived Dutch painting, the Dutch painting of the Golden Age, in a contemporary, modern way. Next slide, please. Roland Holst also initiated the Van Gogh retrospective in Kunstzaal Panorama in Amsterdam in December 1892, which featured not fewer than 86 paintings and 20 drawings from the so-called Van Gogh family collection. These were hung chronologically and thematically, thereby suggesting a more well-rounded oeuvre. Edited by Roland Holst, the exhibition catalogue was the first devoted to Van Gogh's works in the Netherlands. On the cover, the artist is symbolized as a sunflower, both in bloom and broken, at sunset, with a hello, according him the status of a martyr who died for the good cause. The catalogue also included quotes from Van Gogh's letters. Roland Holst presented Van Gogh's works as genuine, waar, and sincere, oprecht. That is, one that could not be understood by the average viewer. It was also unsellable. Next slide, please. Gogh managed to sell several pictures from the collection that had been transferred to the Netherlands from the early 1819 onwards. One of the earliest dated sales of the French mountainous landscape from 1889, on the left, transpired at the exhibition in the Hague Art Circle in May 1892. Curiously enough, the buyer was not Dutch, that is, Johan Rode, artist, art critic and co-founder of Den Vrije Uitstelling in Copenhagen in 1891. A few months later, Gogh also managed to sell a yet unidentified orchard in bloom to a Miss van Eelde for 400 guilders, that is some $30 in 1892. In the following year, pieces from the family collection were shown in dozen large and smaller presentations at art dealers and artists association in several Dutch cities, including Amsterdam, The Hague, Leiden, and Utrecht. These generated more extensive attention for Van Gogh and several sales, mainly works from Van Gogh's French period. Next slide, please, where you see some examples of those works sold. For example, in 1893 to Miss Oldenboom in Amsterdam on the left, or the more well-known Sauer, now in the Krullenmullen Museum, to Johannes Michelsen in Amsterdam for 350 guilders in 1893. Next slide, please. The now famous portrait of Patience Escalier in 1899, for example, next slide, was sold in an exhibition in Leiden. And here you have still some examples. Please, next slide, please. In Leiden for 360 guilders to the later influential art critic, educator, advocate of modern art, and of the work of Van Gogh in particular, Hendrikus Petrus Bremmer, which you see on the right, who was also the advisor of Helene Krullenmüller in building up her collection of works by Van Gogh from 1910 onwards. By 1900, Van Gogh had become more widely known. His reputation, however, was still somewhat diffuse, partly because the reception of his art was strongly discolored by his remarkable biography and mental illness. He was said to have a unique artistic temperament, intense, sincere, naive, fresh, curious, natural. Equally, he was a disturbed genius who struggled alone and desperately against what existed and who, in the fiercest contrast of color, rediscovers the struggle of his own soul, fighting for solace. Such qualifications regarding the unique creative personality of artists came to be firmly established in art literature and art criticism during these years. As an expression of individuality, Van Gogh's work became a key to his authenticity, both as a person and as an artist. In 1903, art writer Grada Marius, known as an advocate of the modern Dutch school, included Van Gogh in her retrospective Dutch painting in the 19th century. She portrayed him as a representative of a new formula. According to her, Van Gogh's work was both the desperate act of a zealot and the revelation of a visionary. And, as is the case with visionaries, Van Gogh's art was extremely difficult to place and initially not appreciated by the public. In Marius' eyes, Van Gogh's work had fallen like a meteor on the well-defined fields of our painting. Remarkably, with respect to his French work, he called Van Gogh a descendant of Rubens, which in contrast his Dutch oeuvre had the essence of the old Dutchman. Next slide, please. In 1903, the art dealer Oldenzaal in Rotterdam organized 3 shows of never before exhibited paintings and drawings by Van Gogh from his formative Dutch years, including many pieces the artist had left behind in his studio in Nuenen. For the Dutch public, these exhibitions represented the first comprehensive introduction to the early Van Gogh, in which, according to one art critic, the full expression of his heroic talent and genius could already be discerned. On the occasion of the first exhibition, art critic Reindert Jacobsen wrote about Van Gogh's allegedly clumsy technique, taking still life of Cabbage and clocks, here on the left, as an example. If he seems clumsy, his intentions are different. That Van Gogh lacked skillful technique was perhaps unfortunately for those who admire correctness, but this was also the case with greater artists than he, Rembrandt, to name but one. Van Gogh was even deemed, as noted earlier in French criticism, to be a glory of his people. In December 1903, the Friends of Museum Boijmans purchased Van Gogh's 1885 Poplars near Nuenen, here on the right, the first piece by the artist entering a Dutch public collection. The early 1900s established Van Gogh's international renown as one of the founders of modern Western European painting. In addition to a continuous stream of larger and smaller exhibitions at home and abroad, the publication of parts of Van Gogh's extensive correspondence in various languages contributed largely to disseminating his reputation. In 1905, it was time for the first retrospective of Van Gogh's entire oeuvre. In the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, hired for the occasion by Jo van Gogh and his second husband, Johan Cohen Goschalk, almost 500 paintings and dozens of drawings, largely from the family collection, and supplemented with several loans, were hung in a chronological thematic order. Where in 1892 Van Gogh had been symbolized as a sunflower that had withered under these circumstances, some 15 years later, his sower now adorned the cover of the catalogue. Next slide, please. In his introduction, Cohen Goschalk gave a colored biography in which he wrote about Van Gogh's calling to pursue art. And I quote, "He was touched by life itself, and the artist, which was most alive in him, profoundly moved by the suffering around him, by nature also of ground blankness, felt the irresistible urge to bear witness, but the time it would be to bear witness to the feelings of beauty aroused in him by everything he observed around him." The critics' reactions to the exhibited works ran the gamut from great appreciation to utter contempt. In any case, no one was left untouched. Art critic and champion of the Hague School, Anton Cornelis Loffold, for example, qualified the exhibition as very peculiar, with galleries full of the most bizarre visions that a disturbed soul's struggle for life had of beautiful reality. In his opinion, Van Gogh's endeavor as a misunderstood genius was mainly fodder for psychologists. Loffold's harsh rejection notwithstanding, the exhibition of 1905 attracted many visitors and generated several sales, including 3 paintings for 3,600 guilders to collectors Lodewijk, Cornelis and Hoven, for example, on the left and on the right, including Cornelis Enthoven, whose former impressive collection of Van Goghs was auctioned in 1920, at which Helene Kröller-Müller, mentioned before, bought extensively. The 1905 Amsterdam retrospective mainly garnered Van Gogh's wider international recognition as a pioneer of modern art, including in Germany, where his work had previously been introduced in Berlin by the art dealer Paul Cassirer in 1901. From 1905 onwards, Jo granted Cassirer, as well as his Parisian partner Bernard Jeune, as had previously been given to Amsterdam art dealer C.M. van Gogh, direct access to this family collection and more or less carte blanche to promote Van Gogh internationally. Where Cassirer served the German-speaking countries, Bernard Jeune did for the French-speaking world. May I have the next slide, please? Yea de Bois of the art dealer Van Gogh sold from 1907 to 1946 some 55 paintings and 50 drawings, especially in the Netherlands and Europe. In 1913-14, de Bois showed some 12 paintings from the family collection at the Armory Show, of which several entered American collections decades later. And I show here two examples. Interesting to know is that the asking prices for Van Gogh's work at the Armory Show were at least 10 to 15 times higher than these were at the same moment in the Netherlands. From the late 1880s onwards, Van Gogh went from being an isolated artist, initially known only to a limited, mainly Paris cultural circle, to becoming one of the forerunners of modern art. For many young artists seeking new means of expression to render the rapidly changing world, Van Gogh was the epitome of a sincere, utterly authentic artist. After all, despite isolation, poverty, social opposition, being misunderstood, and physical and psychological problems, he had forged his own path. Moreover, he had managed to give a personal, emotional, and convincing processing of his reality in a unique, novel visual language, an example well worth emulating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Now I turn to Alexander Eiling. Dr. Eiling studied history of art, Scandinavian languages and law at the universities of Passau, Frankfurt am Main, and Edinburgh, where he completed his dissertation on the German Expressionist collection of the Deutsche Bank. In 2002, he started working at the Department of Prints and Drawings at the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. From 2008 to 2010, he was curator of the Wilhelm Hack Museum in Ludwigshafen, and from 2010 to 2018, curator for modern and contemporary art at the Staatliche Kunsthalle in Karlsruhe. Since 2018, Dr. Eiling has been head of modern art at the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. He specializes in the 19th century French art. He curated many significant and notable exhibitions, including Gogh, Classicism and Experiment in 2014, Cézanne, Metamorphoses in 2017, Making Van Gogh, a German love story in 2019, and Renoir, Rococo Revival in 2022. Alex, welcome.
Many thanks, Dorota, for the kind introduction, and many thanks also to Jill Shaw for the invitation to this symposium. It's really interesting for me. So let's start with the first slide, please. Anyone who's ever studied the provenance of Van Gogh's paintings and drawings will be surprised to learn that the majority of his works were once located in Germany. They were acquired by German museums or private collectors, traded by German art dealers, and shown at numerous exhibitions in Germany from 1901 onwards. Today, we assume that before the end of the First World War, there were about 120 paintings and 36 drawings in German public and private collections. As the potpourri on this slide shows, these were mostly works from Van Gogh's last creative years. They encompass this entire variety of motifs and today rank among the masterpieces of his oeuvre. How did it come about that Germany in particular developed into one of Van Gogh's main sales markets? What made the artist so interesting for German museums, collectors, dealers, artists, and art critics? The Städel Museum has devoted itself to this question in 2019 in a major exhibition, which we have given the title Making Van Gogh, spiced up with the admittedly somewhat lurid subtitle A German Love Story. Next slide, please. The history of Van Gogh's reception in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century is extremely complex and encompasses a large number of actors and institutions, of which I can only present a few of the most important here. The starting point for our question was our own collection, for which 2 paintings and a drawing were acquired by our former director Georg Swadzensky in 1908 and 1912 from the galleries of Eugène Drouet and Ambroise Vollard in Paris. Only 2 of the works, the early farmhouse in Nünen and the peasant woman planting potatoes, are still in our collection today. The undoubted star piece, the portrait of Dr. Gachet, was confiscated by the National Socialists in 1937 and sold abroad for foreign currency. The story of the Gachet would fill a lecture of its own and, as we'll see later, was also an important part of our exhibition concept. From this example, however, we can already see one reason why many of the works shown on the first slide are no longer in Germany today. The campaign of the National Socialists against modernism, which they perceived as degenerate, led to an exodus of these works from German museums. But first, let's take a step back again and go to the beginning of the German love story with Van Gogh. On the next slide, please. With the acquisition of 2 works by the artist in 1908, the Städel was quite early, but it was not the first museum in Germany to acquire Van Gogh's works for its own collection. This foresight is due to one of the most important German museums of modern art, the Folkwang Museum in Hagen, which the wealthy heir Karl Ernst Osthaus opened as a private museum in 1902. Unlike the public museums in Germany, Osthaus was free to choose the works he acquired for his collection. He did not have to go through the hassle of raising public funds, nor did he have to deal with the conservative tastes of acquisition commissions or board of trustees. Osthaus began acquiring paintings and drawings by Van Gogh as early as 1902 and continued the practice until approximately 1909-1910. Later, he also sold works by the artist in order to buy other art. For numerous German artists, including Christian Rolf, these acquisitions became important sources of inspiration for their own work. In 1905, he wrote enthusiastically in a letter to a friend, quote, "Osthaus has 4 new Van Goghs and 3 drawings, presumably from his final phase, ingenious and wild." In addition to Van Gogh, Osthaus bought works by Renoir, Cézanne, and Gauguin, which he displayed in the spacious rooms of his private museums. You can see the skylight hall in the Folkwang Museum here on the photograph. And in the back, you will see the portrait, the Van Gogh portrait, which you will find also on the slide. Many of these works have thankfully been preserved, and with a sale of the Osthaus collection after his death, ended up in what is now the Folkwang Museum in Essen. After the Osthaus Museum and the Städel, many German museums began collecting Van Gogh's works in the years before the First World War. Among them are the museums in Bremen, Dresden, Cologne, Magdeburg, Mannheim, Munich, and Stettin. Next slide, please. Vincent van Gogh's early popularity in Germany is also mirrored in the substantial number of private collectors who were already purchasing his works around the turn of the century. Here you can see only an incomplete list of people who acquired works by Van Gogh for their private collections. The list reads in part like a who's who of German society at the end of the Empire and during the Weimar Republic, including artists, art historians, museum directors, and art dealers, as well as German industrials. Many Van Gogh collectors in Germany were Jewish. It may be a woodcut simplification, but Jewish collectors' taste in art was usually more progressive and modern, and usually quite different from the bourgeois elites in Germany, who preferred more conservative works. The Jewish background of many Van Gogh collectors in Germany is another reason why many of the artist's works are no longer in our country today, as their property and usually their lives were taken from them by the Nazis. For example, the banker Paul von Mendelssohn-Bartholdy was forced to sell his 8 Van Gogh paintings. Among them was a version of the sunflowers that you can see hanging in the entrance hall of his castle in the photo. Next slide, please. Besides the Mendelssohn collection, one of Thea Sternheim and her husband, the writer Karl Sternheim, count among the most important Van Gogh collections in Germany. The daughter of a wealthy screw manufacturer, Thea Sternheim had inherited a fortune which she invested in amassing an art collection. The couple acquired their first Van Gogh painting as far back as 1908. By the time they separated in 1919, they had purchased 12 more. The collection was sold off in the years that followed. The list shows the special quality of the Van Gogh works she bought over a period of about 10 years. While in the case of the Sternheim, it was marital disputes that led to the sale of their works. In many cases, the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, the stock market crash of 1929, and the terror of the Nazis led many owners to sell their Van Gogh paintings, which in the meantime had rapidly increased in value in order to maintain their own standard of living or simply to survive. Next slide, please. Many of the German Van Gogh collectors obtained their works through Paul Cassira's gallery in Berlin. Cassira is considered the great mediator of French modernism in Germany. His Berlin gallery became the hub of Van Gogh marketing in Germany. He worked particularly closely with Johanna van Gogh Bonger and was able to exhibit numerous masterpieces of the artist. Cassira had first presented Van Gogh in his showroom in 1901. In the years that followed, he sought to make him known to a wider public. He managed the sale of numerous Van Gogh works and by World War I had organized some 15 further exhibitions. These exhibitions frequently toured Germany. In addition to Berlin, they also guested in Hamburg, Dresden, Munich, Frankfurt, and elsewhere. In 1914, he opened a major retrospective of the artist. At the same time, he published the 2-volume complete edition of Van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo in collaboration with Johanna van Gogh. Reading these letters was good manners in Germany, and not only in artistic circles. People met in salons to discuss them and eagerly absorbed every new detail they could find about the artist. Next slide, please. That the artist achieved such popularity was in parts due to his special biography and probably also to his mental condition, which there was much speculation after his death. That this partially fictionalized biography was capable of shaping the public image of the artist was something that Johanna van Gogh had already feared. Writing, or rather writing poetry about Van Gogh, became an essential part of his posthumous success story. The German art historian Julius Meyer-Graefe played a major part in this. He contributed to this development with his popular writings, which he based on text published in France during the artist's lifetime and shortly after his death. Meyer-Graefe had first mentioned Van Gogh in an article in 1898. In 1904, he devoted an entire chapter of his Entwicklungsgeschichte der modernen Kunst to the artist. The English title is Modern Art, being a contribution to a new system of aesthetics. It was a very influential publication in Germany. The Van Gogh chapter was subsequently published separately as a monograph and beginning in February 1910, marketed largely unchanged as third reviewed edition. In 1920, he wrote a biographical novel called Vincent, to which after several editions, he added the subtitle Novel of a God Seeker. In a mixture of fact and fiction, the author stylized Van Gogh as a failed genius, an art apostle who, in the footsteps of Christ, had sacrificed himself entirely for his art. Next slide, please. To illustrate the dependence of the German Van Gogh reception on the early reception in France, I would like to show an example here. Meyer-Graefe had taken some of the drastic language and the way of characterizing the artist from Albert Aurier. We've already seen him. Aurier had written a first longer article about the artist for the Mercure de France in 1890. The juxtaposition on this slide shows how Meyer-Graefe took up Aurier's interpretation and continued the thread. Meyer-Graefe elaborated on the pathological component in the artist's being that Aurier suspected. Quote, "To watch him paint was a horrible experience. It was to witness an excess of the worst kind where paint splashed like blood. He did not paint with his hands, but with his naked senses." Meyer-Graefe's highly circulated work fueled Van Gogh's interest in private collector circles and shaped the public image of an artist on the brink of madness to this day. Next slide, please. Allow me at this point to make just a brief reference to the following. Irving Stone's novel Vincent van Gogh, Lust for Life, as well as Vincente Minnelli's film based on it, would hardly be conceivable about Maya Grave's myth-making, not to mention Julian Schnabel's film from 2018. Next slide, please. Van Gogh was extremely present in Germany in the first quarter of the 20th century. By World War I, nearly 120 presentations all over the country had featured works by him, attracting the keen interest of the media and artistic circles. These activities culminated in the 1912 Sonderbund exhibition in Cologne, a major survey of modern art. The show devoted the entire first 5 of altogether 29 rooms to Van Gogh. In the foreground, you can see numerous postcards of works by the artist that had been printed. They contributed to the omnipresence of Van Gogh's works in Germany and encouraged numerous artists to take a closer look at his work. Next slide, please. When one looks at the sheer number of masterpieces by the artist in this exhibition, one becomes pale with envy as an exhibition curator today. The Yellow House, the Sunflowers, a version of the Berceuse, and the Ships in Sainte-Marie de la Mer. Many of the works were on loan from German private collections, which still had rich holdings in 1912. Next slide, please. The multitude of exhibitions and the interest of collectors and museums led the prices of the artist's work rising incessantly, in some cases exponentially, a circumstance that triggered resistance in conservative quarters. In a debate conducted with increasingly patriotic arguments, some German artists denounced the supposed prevalence of foreign art in German museums. In 1911, the Worpswede landscape painter Carl Finnen published a protest pamphlet decrying what he considered the overpriced acquisition of the Van Gogh painting Field with Poppies for the Kunsthalle Bremen for 30,000 marks from the gallery of Paul Cassirer. Quote, "So when we see how in Germany 30 to 40,000 marks are being paid these days without further ado for cursory studies by Van Gogh, it must be said that in general the prices for French works have been forced up to a level the German people shouldn't comply with in the long run." As Finnen is using the term French works, it must be explained at this point that at the beginning, Van Gogh was perceived in Germany above all as a French artist. Van Gogh had created most of his masterpieces in France and corresponded largely in French. A turn towards the Germanization of the artist took place around the First World War, when the German expressionists expected support from his art. In his 1940 publication, Expressionism, Paul Fechter even declared Van Gogh to be a kind of Germanic saint of anti-impressionism. But this twist in the reception would also be worth a lecture of its own. Next slide, please. Let's return to Finnen. Finnen's critique was published under the title The Protest by a German Artist. The publication had a wide reach and fueled the discussion. Increasingly, nationalist undertones were mixed into it. Yet before the year was over, numerous artists, museum directors, and critics responded with a counter-publication in which they called for the international orientation of German collections. You see both frontispieces of the writings united on the slide. On the left, The Protest by German Artists, organized by Carl Finnen. On the right, In the Battle Over Art, a response to the protest by German artists. Van Gogh thus came to represent a battle fiercely fought in Germany over modern art. The list of advocates of an international and quality-oriented acquisition policy of German museum reads very impressively and includes such prominent artists as Marc Beckmann, Wassily Kandinsky, Franz Marc, and Max Liebermann. Museum directors such as Alfred Lichtwag of the Hamburger Kunsthalle, Karl Ernst Osthaus from Hagen, and Georg Swazensky, the director of the Städel, also have their say. Next slide, please. Let us now turn to a curious story. The tremendous rise in the prices paid for Van Gogh's works brought forgers to the scene. One of them was the young dancer Otto Wacker, who opened a gallery in Berlin in 1925 and included paintings by the artist in his sales program. In addition to a number of originals, he put forgeries from the studio of his brother Leonhard Wacker on display in his showrooms. He also procured fake Van Goghs from that source for some of his gallerist friends. Eventually, the scam was discovered, leading in 1932 to a spectacular lawsuit that also made a big splash in the media. Historical photographs show Otto Wacker sitting on the far right in front of forgeries the authorities had seized as evidence. If one compares the brilliant colors of Van Gogh's works with Wacker's forgery, one would think that everyone should have noticed this fraud immediately. Leonard Wacker's painting is merely a tired rehash of his model. Nevertheless, Wacker was able to find many buyers for these paintings. Next slide, please. The second part of the Städel exhibition was devoted to the special influence Van Gogh had on German expressionist artists. This influence varies greatly, ranging from a very narrow orientation to gentle echoes to a complete exaggeration of the model. Above all, the artist's rural motifs, some of which he himself had taken from Millet, literally fell on fertile ground among German artists. The narrow orientation we see here in the example of Heinrich Naun not infrequently led to scorn and derision in German art criticism. Next slide, please. The German art critic Ferdinand Avenarius, for example, coined a particular bon mot by describing the adept emulation of artists like Heinrich Naun as Van Gogheln, an amusing verb that could be translated into English as Van Gocheling. Quote, Van Gogh is dead, but the Van Gogh people are alive, and how alive they are. There's not a modern art exhibition from the juryless ones upward that doesn't have some little man or woman engaged in a titanic battle with a potato field, windmill, or melon. It's Van Goghling everywhere. Avenarius was not the only one to create words that ridiculed German artists borrowing from Van Gogh, but his formulation eventually prevailed. Next slide, please. Above all, Van Gogh's numerous self-portraits prompted many German artists to depict themselves in similar manner. Inspired by Julius Meyer-Grefe's biography and excerpts from the artist's correspondence with his brother Theo, a conception of the artist had taken firm hold in the public consciousness. Van Gogh was regarded as the epitome of the suffering artist who, misunderstood by society, had sacrificed himself for his painting. A romantic artist cliché that was both hope and motivation for German artists. A wonderful example of this can be found in the Städel collection. In 1905, Max Beckmann even grew a beard and then depicted himself as Van Gogh's twin brother here. Next slide, please. In the same year, 1905, the members of the artist group Die Brücke, the Bridge, saw works by Vincent van Gogh in an exhibition in Dresden. For the young architecture students Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, and Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, the experience was a revelation and a liberation in one. Van Gogh's example animated them to apply pure color to the canvas directly from the tube. From now on, their paintings were distinguished by strong contrast, heaped on layers of paint in simplified forms. They adopted these practices as a means of underscoring their direct and unambiguous access to their motives. These artists had rejected the standards of painting as taught at the art academies. They were so fascinated with Van Gogh that their fellow Brücke group member Emil Nolde teasingly suggested they should call themselves Van Goghianer instead. Yet the style of the Brücke artist had very little to do with Van Gogh's regular and well-considered application of paint, an observation that German art critics like Paul Fechter brought into the discussion about Van Gogh early on. After seeing an exhibition of Die Brücke in 1907, he said, quote, "At first you get a regular fright when you look at the things. Van Gogh is a downright academy professor by comparison." Next slide, please. There may also be a difference whether male or female artists took their cue from Van Gogh. The female artists of German Expressionism, such as Gabriele Münter, Paula Modersohn-Becker, usually kept more distance from their role model, as they found it difficult to identify with the male-dominated artist myth surrounding Van Gogh's person. Nevertheless, he left traces in their works, as can be seen in the example of Paula Modersohn's depiction, Woman from a Poorhouse. She took the basic structure of Van Gogh's depiction of Augustine Rollin, but transferred the motive into her own formal language. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to give you a few insights into the Städel exhibition Making Van Gogh, in which we have repeatedly tried to show the historical photographic material with the works by the artist in one room. For example, we chose large photo wallpapers with motifs from the Museum Folkwang or the Sonderbund exhibition. Next slide, please. In the case of the painting Portrait of Dr. Gachet, which once belonged to the Städel collection, we had to take a special route. The painting is currently in a Swiss private collection and was not available for our exhibition. However, since the confiscation, we have kept the old frame in our depot, with which the painting was acquired from Eugène Drouet in 1912. We have chosen to place a tree standing in the room in order to ostentiously emphasize the void that Göring's confiscation action has torn in our holdings. However, the place was perceived less as a painful loss. Instead, it became the most popular selfie spot in the exhibition, as people seem to enjoy having their picture taken in frames. Next slide, please. And last but not least, here we take a look at the juxtaposition of Van Gogh's works with those of the German Expressionists. To the left, you see the combination of the Berceuse with Modersohn Becker's Old Woman, and to the right, Van Gogh's painting French novels with works by Joseph Schal and August Macke. Next slide, please. For those who would like further information on the subject of Van Gogh in Germany, I recommend a series of exhibition catalogs from the last decades, which have been a valuable basis of our research. Essen, Amsterdam, Bremen, Amsterdam again, New York, Cologne, and of course our Frankfurt catalog. A wonderful treasure trove of quotations from early critique and letter passages can be found very compactly in Susan Stein's publication Van Gogh, a Retrospective. And for those who would like to study Van Gogh and Paul Cassire's gallery more closely, I recommend Walter Falkenfeld and Bernhard Echter's research. Last but not least, the exciting history of the portrait of Dr. Gachet in the German museum landscape is excellently presented in Cynthia Salzman's 1998 publication, The Story of Van Gogh's Masterpiece. Next slide, please. That was only brief and, of course, completely incomplete outline of Van Gogh's reception history in Germany, but I hope I have given you some insight, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker is Carol Jacobi. She is Curator of British Art, 1850 to 1915 at Tate, Britain, but works across periods, including modern and contemporary art and historic photography. She has a PhD in art history, MA in 19th century English literature, and an MA in paintings conservation. She was a professor at Birkbeck, the Courtauld Institute, and elsewhere, and held the Leverhulme Fellowship in the History of Portraiture at the National Portrait Gallery. Carol's prime passion is looking afresh at historic art through 21st century perspectives and new research. Groundbreaking exhibitions and displays include Van Gogh and Britain. Carol, welcome.
If I do drop out for a longer than 30 seconds, I apologize, and perhaps you could go on to the next one until I get it sorted out. Okay, so Van Gogh and Britain. What really astonished me when I was researching this show when it opened at Tate in 2019 was that it had been 72 years since our last Van Gogh exhibition. That was in 1947. I'll come back to that at the end. One of the highlights of the show, could you go next slide, please? One of the highlights of the show was this life-sized image of Van Gogh House in South London, which has since opened to the public. And this is where Van Gogh stayed in his early 20s. And he enjoyed this sort of strange British enthusiasm of front gardens, but also he sort of responded to British culture, where many of his lifelong preoccupations began to evolve. So particularly those sort of kind of socialist approaches to class and so on, the concern for a beautiful realism. And the first half of this large exhibition was devoted to how British culture sort of weaves into Van Gogh's development and his late work. One of the questions we wanted to ask was, did the British reception of Van Gogh respond to his response to us? Was there any kind of continuity there? Can you go to the next slide, please? the second part of the exhibition looked in return at the way British culture responded to Van Gogh and how he changed from a man who lived unknown in that lodging house, who wondered unnoticed in our National Gallery, to that hero of 1947, whose pictures, especially the sunflowers, would become the National Gallery's most famous work of art. Next slide, please. I don't have time, but I just wanted to give you a little kind of taste of the kind of conversations that were going on between Van Gogh's relationship with British prints, but also simultaneously his actual relationship with London in images like this. And the next slide, please. And this is his only British scene. But in particular, the exhibition started with a bookshelf, and the bookshelf included a whole range of British literature that Van Gogh owned and read in English. There were 200 of those in all, and sort of emphasizing that he was a sort of fluent speaker and reader of English his whole life, particularly Dickens, who was his hero. Next slide, please. So the first Van Gogh painting to come back in the other direction to reach this country was during his lifetime, and it was this portrait of a Scottish art dealer, Alexander Reid, made when Reid was living with Van Gogh and his brother Theo in this flat that you can see in the picture, where they spent many evenings chatting. As you see, is exactly what he's doing. And Van Gogh gave Reid this portrait, next slide please, and Reid gave Van Gogh this painting by Adolphe Monticelli. And Monticelli was selling very well in England and America, but not in France. And Van Gogh loved this centralized composition, the rich color, the thick paint, and began famously his own series of flower paintings. Next slide, please. Which of course culminated in his most renowned challenge to Monticelli. And he went down south in a way emulating Monticelli, a work that Van Gogh vaguely hoped when he painted it, it might also, like Monticelli, find a place in Britain. And so we have another sort of entanglement really early on here. And of course, he couldn't have been more right. The sunflowers found a very welcome home here. But this date, he was unknown. And in fact, Reid's father gave that portrait of Reid away literally with a day or so of it arriving in Glasgow. He saw no value in it. And so I think, one point I wanted to make was that artists, I think in general, were quicker to be interested in what Van Gogh was doing and understand him than dealers. One of the first of these was Irish painter Roderick O'Connor. Can you, next slide, please? Who saw Van Gogh's work in Paris and visited Theo just after Van Gogh died. And his paintings, you can see, incorporated Van Gogh's humble subjects, his finding beauty in the ordinary. And these apples were actually bought by Reid for Van Gogh when they're on a walk, and his colour and his thick directional strokes. Next slide, please. So Theo died 6 months after Van Gogh, as we know, and his wife, Jo, amazingly, and she was a real hero of our exhibition, continued to arrange exhibitions in Europe. And I think it's interesting that she'd studied in Britain as had Van Gogh's sisters, spoke English, and 20 years later, next slide, please, she lent her most important, and she was very careful about what she lent, 27 paintings to Roger Fry's exhibition devoted to artists such as Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Manet, which was called Manet and the Post-Impressionists, and which coined the term Post-Impressionists. We did a lot of research into the way that it was Van Gogh's works that was specially foregrounded in sort of satire and criticism around this show, particularly the portraits. Next slide, please. And in particular, actually, Boy with Cornflower got misgendered and laughed at and endlessly reproduced, as did Madame Roland. So that sort of brings me to two more points about reception. First is that this sort of incredibly important parallel, which other speakers have also foregrounded between the history of publication and the history of Van Gogh reception. And as Alex said, this sort of early dependence on French publication, the Bernard book being a particularly important one. We sort of had a lot of fun just sort of painstakingly tracking down the order of the illustrations and what was reproduced in those illustrations, so that we could, and also alongside looking at journeys that British artists were making and what exhibitions they saw, so we could put together a very, very rigorous set of connections between works they'd seen, either in reproduction or in reality, and works they were painting. And I was really excited to see those postcards in that photograph in that 2012 exhibition, Alex, because the postcards turned out to be particularly important. The second point to emerge out of the this Manet and the post-impressionist 1910 moment, which is a huge moment for British art generally, was the way that the story of Van Gogh's mental health and the way that's wrapped up in his reception by artists and by the public as well as collectors. And of course, it details of Van Gogh's mental history and his self-harm, as well as his suicide, were published from the moment they happened. And British comments around the Manet and the post-impressionists were very much reflected the prejudices of the day around mental health, interpreting his sort of unfamiliar, innovative style as expressions of, inverted commas, madness. And I'd just like to direct your attention to a really interesting essay by Anna Grenzner-Robbins, where she actually looks, analyzes and does a survey of the language around mental health in those 1910 reviews. Next slide, please. And so again, Van Gogh's biggest fans on the other side were artists, and particularly the Camden Town Group, and especially Harold Gilman. And Gilman had inherited a similar social conscience, particular political views from British politics that Van Gogh picked up when he was here. And so there was sort of there was this sympathy, ideological sympathy, and I think you can see that in this rather wonderful painting of Mrs. Mounter, the person who shared his lodgings with him, who was a domestic cleaner. And this is one of the very first Van Goghs ever to be published in colour in Britain, and to be available in colour. And Van Gogh and Gilman used to actually pin any reproduction he could get up on the wall of his studio. And before he began painting, he would salute the self-portrait of Van Gogh, and he'd say, "À toi, Van Gogh," before ever he... Okay, I dropped out, but I come back again. The fourth part took from Van Gogh what they were interested in at the time. So these artists were interested in form and colour. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And this comparison, I think, is really telling, these two works. These are all works that were in the show. So Van Gogh's wonderful painting of the garden at the Asylum Hotel at Saint-Remy. And when he painted his view from his window near Mornington Crescent in London. But what he saw when he looked at that picture was innovations of composition and colour. So the all-over pattern of green foliage and branches, contrasting with the red earth, the figure on the path and the buildings peeping through the branches. And this is complete absence of that expressionist aspect of Van Gogh. It's not here yet. And can you carry on, please? Thank you. So the most admired paintings at Man in the Post-Impressionists were the two versions of sunflowers that were on show there. And they have been inspiring British artists from the first. So if you, next slide, please. So this one, this very early example by Frank Brangwyn was a response to the Van Gogh's 5 sunflowers, which is now lost, that he saw in Paris. Next slide, please. But again, artists in general kind of borrow here a lot of these flower pictures. I love this quote by Roger Fry. Modern European art has always mistreated flowers, dealing them with as at best as aids to sentimentality, until Van Gogh saw the arrogant spirit that inhabits the sunflower. And the next slide, please. So we had a whole room. We had the sunflowers back to Tate for the first time since 1961, and we had it surrounded by a whole room of British British tributes to it in a way. Next slide, please. Van Gogh also reflected British landscape painting. Next slide, please. In particular, British artists who were involved in something called the Cult of Provence, where they not only went down to the south of France and painted like Van Gogh, but they also, next slide, please, lived by him. So as you see here with Matthew Smith and Vanessa Bell again, who both lived down there. So the decisive influence during this period, next slide please, was Jo van Gogh Bonga's publication. It's one of the last things she did, publication of the letters in English completely. And this really deepened and changed the entanglement of British art and public with Van Gogh, and put it on a whole new personal level, because they were avidly read by artists. Again, we had a lot of fun finding all these artists' own copies, their own first editions of Van Gogh's letters, and they sort of found his sort of gripping and tragic life story a new model for what it was to be an artist. This absolute commitment, these humble needs, not showing off your lovely studio like they had in the 19th century, a little concern with money or reputation. And so the first influential biographies, of course, also contributed to this cult of the artist. And Graf has already been described to us, which was published almost straight away in English, just in time for Van Gogh's first solo show at the Leicester Galleries, largely organised by Alexander Reed's dealership that we met earlier. And there's a lovely quote, my Graf, which in English read, which gives you a flavour, I think. The drama of the man was predicted in his pictures, this linking of the human to the paint. We race along with him, breathless, whither, no matter, for we follow a man, a hero, perhaps the last. So most famously, Van Gogh's story was, as Alex has mentioned, novelised and sensationalised in Irving Stone's book, Lust for Life, which came out 10 years later. And so artists in general engage with Van Gogh's life, and particularly places, motifs, objects that came to have these personal significance, as you can see with William Nicholson's boots here. Next one, please. And perhaps the artist that identified most closely with Van Gogh was Christopher Wood. Like Van Gogh's, his life story was almost like a guide to how to be an artist and how to paint for Wood. He was largely self-taught, like Van Gogh, but he also sort of modelled his idea of himself as an artist on Van Gogh. He also experienced mental illness, and he also took his own life a bit younger than Van Gogh at 32. And here you can see, I think, a very sort of sophisticated take on Van Gogh's bedroom, which would influence many. We had Lowry's bedroom, we had so many bedrooms in the show. Next slide, please. You can see one of the paintings exhibited in Van Gogh's solo show on the wall in Christopher Wood's picture. Next slide, please. So after the letters and the solo show, Van Gogh reached the heart of the British establishment. So this, just had happened in, just about 20, 25 years. And when the Royal Academy did a huge survey of Dutch art, of the, you had Vermeer, you had Rembrandt. It concluded with this huge room of 18 Van Goghs, so complete turnaround. And the madman of the years before the war was now described in the Royal Academy catalogue as a brilliant and unhappy genius. So not a complete moving on. The mental health is still at the centre. And this wonderful self-portrait made in the asylum and one of his last landscapes, Farmer Auvert, were both in the exhibition. And these late self-portraits, that self-contemplations made in between breakdowns, and the depictions of the fields in which he spent his last days, they sort of began to attract this particular fascination, which continues to this day. Next slide, please. During the war, obviously no one could actually see any real Van Goghs. There weren't yet all that many in this country. Afterwards, next slide, please. They were triumphantly, reintroduced to the world in a whole series of shows all across Europe, including our Tate exhibition, which was an Arts Council exhibition at Tate, Birmingham and Glasgow, which, as you can see from this photograph, the crowds in the rain, it got the most enormous following. Apparently our cloakroom had never been so full of baby buggies as it was for this. So it's interesting, the demographic of people that were coming, and 4,500 people visited a day. And that's just because partly the figure of Van Gogh had come to complement the ideals of post-war Britain. It had been run by, a breaking down of the class barriers. He sort of stood in Britain for the dignity of the ordinary man and work and suffering. And that was expressed in the founding of the Arts Council and not to mention the National Health Service around the same time. I've dropped out again. Yeah, thanks. Artists were inspired by this sound. Oh, sorry. I'll just put this in because I just thought it was absolutely cultures in the film The Third Man. You can see hanging in the background here. Sorry, carry on. So artists have this sudden gesture who was living in poverty and obscurity, partly due to the war, and made a series of brooding self-portraits that were inspired particularly by Van Gogh with a banded ear. Next slide, please. This is a rather wonderful portrait of the novelist Roald Dahl, who, by Matthew Smith, who had been sort of one of the first followers of Van Gogh, but who had lost his son, an aviator, and painted this picture of Roald Dahl as an aviator, I think inspired by Van Gogh's only military portrait of the Zouave. The next one, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I have actually got that to show you. Next one, please. And, so the sunflowers come back, but in this totally kind of different mood. You get this rethinking of nature after the war in the context of the sort of the atomic bomb and the Cold War, and you get this explosive nuclear nature in the work of both Bomberg and Matthew Smith. And it's great to contrast. Next slide, please. this early Matthew Smith made at the time of the Manet and the Post-Impressionist exhibition, which is all pretty, and this sort of later response to the Van Gogh. And he's still making drawings of the Van Gogh sunflowers in his sketchbooks around the time, you know, at the end of his career here. So he's still thinking about that picture. Next slide. So we can, so I just wanted to show you, we weren't able to include Joan Erdely, but she was another painter in the 40s and 50s who was really sort of channeling Van Gogh in these expressionist, very interesting ways. Next slide, please. This wonderful paint work. Next slide, please. And I think it's really interesting how by this time, everyone, partly because of Irving Stone, but everyone just believed that this was Van Gogh's last painting. They were obsessed with what one Van Gogh's last painting was. And even because of the film, they had this idea that this is actually the painting in which he shot himself, which of course is not true at all. But it's really interesting that, you know, this became one of the dominant myths. So this is picked up by the last painter that was in the exhibition, which is yes, next slide, please. Who made a series of paintings based on a Van Gogh painting that had been destroyed during the war. So that added to its poignancy, the painter on the road to Tarascon. So again, to Provence, photographs, but also on Vincent Minnelli's 1956 Technicolor biopic of Irving Stone's book, Lust for Life. Next slide. Next slide, all right, please. And so, and when we know that he was popping into the Curzon cinema all the time when he was to Tarascon, so you can see some of the paintings pick up on the imagery in the film rather than the image. I think it's interesting to see Van Gogh through the eyes of British artists. Modernism, which is you know, not Henry Moore and so on, but a genealogy, a modernism of artists to exhibit a picture with Van Gogh in Paris in 1905, right through to Francis Bacon. What we overall hope to do with this exhibition was to their idea of a maverick, passionate painter through the historical and social changes of the century. But we also hope to ask people how we want to see Van Gogh in the 21st century. So one of the things we really pushed forward in the show was Van Gogh with his painting. We about it and how we view it around the show. And then we also looked at how more recent artists had looked at his work. So alongside the show, we had Rose Finn Kelsey's Bureau de Change, which responded to the sale of and the guarding it. And then finally, at the same time as the Van Gogh show, next slide, please, we had our first retrospective of the art of Frank Bowling, and he was fascinated about the importance in love with them here. But anyway, and on the occasion of the show, of sunflowers.
Hi, Carol. I'm afraid we are having some connectivity issues. So if we cannot hear you at the moment. So I think I will introduce our next speaker. We will hear now from my colleague, Gogh. Jill is head of the James Pearson Duffy Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, and Rebecca A. Boylan and Thomas W. Sidlick, Curator of European Art, 1850 to 1970, at the Detroit Institute of Arts. A specialist in 19th and 20th century European art, she earned her BA from Northwestern University and her MA and from the University of Chicago. Before joining the DIA in January 2016, she held positions at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, and Colgate University. Her recent exhibition project for the DIA include Monet, Framing Life in 2017-2018, Extraordinary Eye, Extraordinary Gift, The Legacy of Margaret Hertz Demand in 2019, and Humble and Human, Impressionist Era Treasures from the Albright Knox Art Gallery and the Detroit Institute of Arts, an exhibition in honor of Ralph C. Wilson Jr. in 2019. Again, Jill is the curator of the DIA's Van Gogh in America exhibition. Jill, turning to you.
Thanks, much appreciated, especially for moderating. And I'll thank for tuning in today. My colleagues search with us, and of course, I have to put them yet visited exhibition here at Institute of Art. So. If you can come, next slide, please. So first, I wish that my presentation really built upon my remarkable scholars who are exhibition catalog slide. We call out already today. Krika, Joost Vicker, and our very Judika. So much to this upon reporting. Next slide. Next slide. Today, imagine a time when not embrace the, but this phase.
Hi, Jill. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are having sound issues. So if you could log out and log in, that may solve the problem, hopefully. Jill should be able to come back shortly.
Hi, is this better?
It's better. It's better. I think the issue has been fixed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dorota. I'm not sure what all you have heard, but I will just say that this presentation is truly informed by the research of generous colleagues, Chris Stolwijk, you've heard from today, and many others who contributed to this exhibition project. And in the United States today, I mean, I think it's really difficult to imagine a time when Americans didn't embrace the work of Vincent van Gogh. But his fame in America was not straightforward or quick. And even though Van Gogh's popularity in Europe skyrocketed, especially in Germany, as we've heard about today, following his premature death in 1890, it really took decades to familiarize Americans with his work. Van Gogh's path to posthumous stardom in the United States involved a series of false starts, forgeries, missed opportunities, courageous moves, and sensationalized tales in print and on screen. The story that we tell in our exhibition, Van Gogh in America, which is currently on view and through January 22nd, begins over 20 years after the artist's death and culminates in the 1950s with Hollywood transforming him into an icon. So before 1913, short of traveling to Europe, Americans could only read about Van Gogh and see a selection of his works in black and white print publications. Texts in English began to appear in the early 1900s. They promoted an embellished view of Van Gogh as a tragic hero, rather than focusing on his artistic achievements and skill. The article I'm showing you on the screen now considers Rudolf Meyer-Richtall's two-part article on Van Gogh in the Burlington magazine, as well as the Manet and the Post-Impressionist exhibition that took place in 1910 at the Grafton Galleries in London that we've just heard Carol speak to us about. And stated in the last bit of the announcement of Meyer-Richtall's article, it says, quote, his critic, an ardent admirer, says that he cannot differentiate between the works of the sane and the insane Van Gogh, end quote. Next slide. In 1912, so, I mean, to back up just a tiny bit, in the United States, we really started hearing sensationalized tales of, and primarily of Vincent's biography. But in 1912, following the successful Cologne Sonderbund exhibition, which you've also heard about today, there was an announcement in the New York Times that the Berlin Photographic Society was making plans to display a collection of Van Gogh's paintings in its gallery in New York City. And the New York Times states, quote, the public very probably will quail before their stark logic and their uncompromising color, end quote. This exhibition, which was organized and would have been the first viewing of Van Gogh's work on American soil, did not take place. Next slide. In that same year, 1912, 3 American private collectors acquired Van Gogh works. The first painting, which is at the left, a version of the postman Joseph Rouland, was bought by Philadelphia pharmaceutical tycoon Albert Barnes around February 1912. This was followed by John Quinn, who purchased the self-portrait that we see at the center here. This was the second painting to enter an American collection. It's now in the collection of the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. This was purchased in September 1912 by New York attorney and modern art advocate John Quinn, several months after Barnes made his initial acquisition. This self-portrait received considerable exposure. Once it was in Quinn's possession, it appeared in the 1913 Armory Show, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, and also in 2 group shows at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art in the early 1920s. At right, we see a work that American artist Catherine S. Dreyer purchased following her visit to the 1912 Sonderbund exhibition in Cologne, which, as we've heard, included over 125 Van Gogh works and really served as a model for the Armory show organizers. For Dreyer, seeing his art in the Sonderbund exhibition was like, quote, stepping out of a stuffy room into glorious bracing air, end quote. In addition to the Armory show, Dreyer would lend this painting to other exhibitions in the early 1920s, including one in Detroit in 1922. Next slide, please. So two of the 3 works that I've just mentioned would be displayed the following year when Van Gogh's work debuted publicly for the first time in the United States at the International Exhibition of Modern Art, which opened in 1913 at the 69th Regiment Armory in New York City. We now commonly know this exhibition we call it the Armory Show, and it really introduced American audiences to the radical developments taking place in modern art in Europe and in America. So this massive exhibition, including over 1,300 European and American objects, sparked extensive commentary among visitors and in the press, and a smaller version of it traveled to Chicago and Boston. And the image you're seeing now is the only historical documentation of what that presentation looked like. This was from the second venue of the show. So this is at the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's a partial view of the installation of Van Gogh works included there. From our research for our exhibition catalog, the Armory show we now know included at least 21 Van Gogh works, even though the exhibition catalog only lists 18 works. And the pictures were divided among still life, figure painting, and landscapes. Next slide, please. So one reviewer of the Armory show noted that some of the artist's paintings were, quote, much studied and wondered over. A less enthusiastic critic wrote Van Gogh off as a moderately competent impressionist who was heavy-handed, had little, if any, sense of beauty, and spoiled a lot of canvas with crude, quite unimportant pictures. But works like Dance Hall at Arles, which you see reproduced in the Chicago Tribune here, and at Wright as well, it's now in the Orsay's collection. It was said to have made, quote, the most impression on the public, end quote. I'll mention that notably all of the works, except for 2 on view at the Armory show, which were those 2 that were lent by John Quinn and Catherine Dreyer, were available for sale, and none of them sold, indicating a lackluster interest among American buyers. Next slide. In the 19-teens, a number of players in the United States tried to keep Van Gogh on the scene in New York and in other cities across the country. In 1914, Stefan Bourgeois mounted an exhibition featuring 4 paintings attributed at the time to Van Gogh, including the work in the center that is now in a Berlin collection. Stefan Bourgeois would lend the same work to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, California in 1915. It was the only work on view in that 1915 World's Fair exhibition, and it made it the very first Van Gogh painting to be shown on the West Coast of the United States. And in October 1915, Van Gogh's nephew, Vincent Willem van Gogh, and his wife, Josina, temporarily moved to New York and contributed to the artist's first solo show in America at the Modern Gallery, led by Marius de Zayas. and he contributed the work Butterflies and Poppies at Right. Next slide. We've heard much about Jo van Gogh Bonger today, Vincent's sister-in-law. She also came to the United States a little bit later in August 1916, and she lived in New York City during the duration of the war. She lent 67 works to what would be Van Gogh's first major US commercial gallery show at the Montrose Gallery in New York in 1920. Next slide, please. From that exhibition, again, 67 works, only 3 sold, and they were all to a single buyer. In the early 1920s, Americans just still weren't ready to embrace Van Gogh. Its bold color, its paint application, but also because of the prices that Jo and the European market had already established for his work. And I'll just share that these were the 3 works that were purchased from that 1920 exhibition, all by the same buyer, a minister who lived near Philadelphia, whose name was Theodore Pitcairn. Next slide, please. And the Van Gogh story in America hit a milestone in 1922 when the Detroit Institute of Arts became the first museum in the United States to buy one of his paintings, the now iconic self-portrait of 1887. And given that only a select few of Van Gogh's works had even been shown in an American museum by this time, the DIA's purchase was described as courageous by the contemporary press. And I will also just add that we purchased this work at public auction in New York. It was the collection of Dick Roncoleckian, an art dealer, and Theodore Pitcairn, who we have just been speaking about, was keen to also bid on this work at auction. There is, that one little silver bullet that we haven't been able to locate, which describes the snafu that took place, and Theodore Pitcairn wasn't able to bid on this work for the snafu that we don't exactly know. Next slide. So on the evening of January 31st, 1922, we made history. The DIA made history when Ralph Harmon Booth, president of the City of Detroit Arts Commission, attended this auction and on behalf of the museum successfully bid on the self-portrait. The DIA at the time was augmenting its holdings in anticipation of a new, larger building that would open its doors in 1927. And the painting was initially displayed among the old master paintings in the DIA's original building on Jefferson Avenue. And according to one account in the press, our self-portrait held its own. Next slide, please. And in a note from the art advisor, com director of the DIA, William Valentiner, to Ralph Booth 2 months after the acquisition, Valentiner wrote, quote, "I congratulate the museum. It seems very courageous to buy works by these remarkable masters. Especially Van Gogh seems to me one of the great ones. I hope it will be appreciated by the people in Detroit, if not now. I do not doubt sometime in the future," end quote. And here in Detroit right now, we're celebrating these very prescient words. Next slide. By the late 1920s, attitudes towards Van Gogh had changed dramatically in the United States. When New York's Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, opened its doors in 1929, its inaugural exhibition celebrated the pioneers of modern art. And that was Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, and Van Gogh. The show that was organized by MoMA's founding director, Alfred Barr Jr., included at least 28 works said to be by Van Gogh. Primarily, the works came from East Coast private collectors, with a few additions from the Van Gogh family collection, as well as other European and American collections. But the only museums in America which owned Van Gogh paintings to lend to the MoMA show were the DIA, Detroit, the DIA, which lent our self-portrait, and the Art Institute of Chicago, which had been given 4 paintings thought to be by Van Gogh in 1926. They lent just 2, one of which was the bedroom, one of the 3 bedroom paintings on view now in our exhibition here in Detroit. And the next slide. And we were really excited here, you know, in the United States to take note that it wouldn't just be Detroit that is deserving of celebratory remarks here, but also the Midwest, the Midwestern United States more generally. The next 4 Van Goghs after Detroit and then Chicago by passive acquisition in terms of a bequest. The next 4 Van Goghs to be purchased by public US museums. All of them are on view very pridefully in our exhibition, were acquired by Midwestern institutions. The Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, the St. Louis Art Museum, and the Toledo Museum of Art. Next slide, please. You know, in my tours of the exhibition, I say we are celebrating the Midwest, but we cannot leave the East Coast out of this because in 1935, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, organized Van Gogh's first American museum retrospective. It presented about 127 works drawn primarily from the collections of Vincent Willem van Gogh, the artist's nephew, and Netherlands-based modern art collector Eiling Kroller-Müller. The exhibition came on the heels of the 1934 publication of Irving Stone's Lust for Life, a best-selling novel based on the life of the artist. This book captured the public's imagination and really galvanized interest in Van Gogh in the United States. This exhibition was a sensation, probably the first exhibition to be termed a blockbuster. And the show generated spectacular attendance in New York, as well as the 4 other scheduled American venues. Over 50 museums clamored to be added to this tour, but the exhibition was only able to travel in reduced form to 5 additional stops, one of which was the Detroit Institute of Arts. And by the end of the tour in 1937, nearly 1 million Americans had taken the opportunity to see Van Gogh's works in person. And there were a couple of things that were pretty special about the MoMA show. First, it showed the tremendous breadth of Van Gogh's work and what he was able to accomplish in just 10 years as an artist. And also, it served as a sort of antidote to the sensationalized story that was presented by Irving Stone, in addition to other writers before him. And the MoMA exhibition catalog let Vincent speak for himself in a way. There were not art historical essays included in the catalog, but rather the entire catalog was filled with only quotes from Van Gogh's letters. For the next slide, please. So for this retrospective tour that MoMA originally organized, the last venue went back to New York, went back to MoMA, and closed in January 1937. And when the exhibition finally went back to MoMA, several works were added to the checklist, including the Nocturnal Companion to the Olive Trees, which were in the entire tour. And the nocturnal companion, of course, is The Starry Night, which was lent by a Rotterdam collector. And it would be the first work by Van Gogh to be acquired by a New York museum, but not until 1941. So that's nearly 2 decades after the Detroit Institute of Arts bought its self-portrait. Next slide. So by the 1930s, the popular media in the United States was inundated with sensationalized accounts of Van Gogh's life story. As I mentioned before, one corrective was to let the artist speak for himself through his letters, an approach that was taken in MoMA's 1935 retrospective. But that Van Gogh myth was irrepressible, especially after director Vincent Minnelli adapted the hugely popular novel Lust for Life for the screen. The film was a critical success, and it further cemented the perception of the artist as a tragic hero, a loner working on the verge of crisis. And so biopics like Lust for Life featured paintings for visual inspiration and as props, and really afforded incredible mainstream exposure to the artworks that were featured in it. And we could not have an exhibition about the rise of Van Gogh's fame in America without discussing these Hollywood treatments. And we especially chose to highlight Lust for Life because of the uncanny resemblance of Kirk Douglas to the DIA self-portrait, which ultimately cemented the iconic nature of our painting. And you'll see those at right. But in addition to consuming Van Gogh on the silver screen, America wanted to consume him for their personal collections, and particularly Hollywood studio executives and actors wanted to consume him for their personal collections. And at left, you'll see the movie star Errol Flynn, as well as film noir legend Edward G. Robinson, who owned works by Van Gogh. And some of them were even included in Pabst Blue Ribbon beer advertisements in the United States. And of course, other Hollywood stars who collected works by Van Gogh included Elizabeth Taylor. Next slide. And in sum, our exhibition here in Detroit tells a story of the twists and turns that Van Gogh's reception faced in the United States. And it also celebrates the 100-year anniversary of the bold purchase of Van Gogh's self-portrait by the DIA, while private collectors welcomed his work into their collections in the 1920s. It would not be until nearly a decade later that other museums would follow suit. And in our exhibition, we also want to forge the idea that we need to be mindful of the ways that American popular culture has presented his biography. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Our last speaker is Tsukasa Kodera. Dr. Kodera is professor of Western art history, specializing in modern art at the Osaka University. He received his doctorate from the University of Amsterdam and was awarded Erasmus Study Prize for his doctoral dissertation. In 2004, he was a visiting scholar at the Jewish Historical Institute at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. Among his numerous scholarly contributions are Vincent van Gogh, Christianity versus Nature, published in 1990, The Mythology of Vincent van Gogh, published in 1993, The Jews and the Modern Art, published in 2016, and Van Gogh and Japan, issued in 2017. Tsukasa, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to this really interesting event. I'm now reading a proof of my book on this topic, The Genesis and Transformation of Van Gogh Worldwide. It will be published first in Japanese in March, and I was just planning to publish at least part of these contents in English as well. I would not use the word reception because it does not describe the phenomenon correctly. Making Van Gogh, the title used by the Städel exhibition, is more accurate. The Van Gogh was not received by later generations, but was made, created, transformed, appropriated by his family, artists, art dealers, collectors, forgers, critics, biographers, museum curators, art historians, film industries, and all kinds of cultural industries, art market, and exhibition market as well. I'm talking briefly and chronologically about the making of Van Gogh in Japan from 1910 until today. Next slide, please. As far as known today, the name Van Gogh was first mentioned in 1910 in an article on Berlin Secession, and the next year part of his letters was translated and published. Some of his works were immediately reproduced in black and white. The making started first by the hands of novelists, poets, and gradually by painters, who had a chance to see Van Gogh's works in France or Germany. Next slide, please. 1918. During the World War II, Theo's son Vincent William was working in the US company and was later transferred to Kobe, Japan. There he met Tei Nishimura, independent art historian, and gave him the address of his mother Yo van Hochbonger in Amsterdam. Next, please. An industrialist in Osaka, Koyata Yamamoto, bought Van Gogh's sunflowers for 80,000 French francs. It was later destroyed by the air raid during the World War II. Well, let's see the growth of the Japanese economy. Next, please. Around 1920. During the World War I, Japanese GNP increased. The number of the rich industrialists increased enormously from 1920. And after 1919, Japanese yen became stronger against French franc. If Yamamoto had bought the same sunflower penny 5 years before, namely in 1915, he had to pay 5 times more in Japanese yen. But in 1926, when French francs was weakest, he could have bought the painting with only a half price in yen. Between 1915 and 1926, there was almost 10 times difference of price in Japanese yen for 80,000 francs. Next, please. Among 250 works of Western art collected by 15 Japanese collectors between 1890 and 1940, more than 190, 70% were purchased between 1919 and 1926. The situation of weak French francs was naturally the same for collectors in other countries outside France. Next, please. As David Chalice has demonstrated convincingly, major collections of French modernist paintings were formed exactly in the same period, in the 1920s and the 1930s. Chalice discussed the cases of Samuel Courtauld, Albert Burns, and Kojiro Matsukata, but there are more collections like Oscar Reinhardt in Winter Tour and many other private collections in more countries. Quite ironically, the French modernist paintings, including Van Gogh, could diffuse much more quickly and abundantly in foreign collections and enjoyed their reputation worldwide thanks to the weak French franc. Next, please. Back to Japan in 1920s, when the Japanese could travel to France much more cheaply than before. There were many Japanese travelers and art students in Paris. In the Musée Guimet in Paris, 3 visitors' books of Paul Gachet Jr. in Auvers are preserved. In the 3 volumes there are about 280 signatures of the Japanese who visited Paul Gachet collections in Auvers between 1922 and 1939. Next, please. They were mainly painters, critics, and art historians. Most of them later played important roles in Japanese art world. Paul Gachet Jr. himself said after the World War II that 320 Japanese visited him since 1921, while the French people started to visit him just recently. He said, I quote, "Now French journalists, TV are approaching me and ladies scream watching my Van Goghs in exhibitions, très 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 beau, but before the war they were just abusing his paintings," unquote. Next, please. This is Yuzo Saiki with Paul Gauguin Jr. Next, please. These are Japanese in Orville Show Wars. Next, please. In October 1923, Tei Nishimura, who had met Vincent Willem in Japan and had received Yo's address from him, made a trip to Europe and visited Yo's address Koninginweg 77, Amsterdam. He visited Yo suddenly without appointment. Yo must have been surprised of the sudden visit of a young Japanese, but she welcomed him in her apartment and showed him Van Gogh's works. As she had heard from Gachet that some young Japanese were putting flowers at the graves of the Van Gogh brothers in Auvers, she knew that Japanese are very interested in Van Gogh. Yo then phoned Yosina, Vincent Willem's wife, and Nishimura was invited for dinner at Vincent Willem's home, where he could enjoy other Van Gogh's works as well. Next, please. These are interiors of the Yo's house, which Nishimura must have seen. Here is a Japanese scroll painting, and there are two Japanese masks, no masks here. Next, please. These are also interiors of the Yo's house. Next, please. In 1927 and 1929, a successful Japanese painter of traditional style, Kansetsu Hashimoto, and his family, including 5 small children, visited Paul Gauguin Jr. in Auvers. They have been taken a film in which we can see Paul Gauguin Jr. talking with Japanese visitors and Hashimoto family with 5 small children working in the Auvers cemetery. After Auvers, they visited Vincent Willem's house in Laren and could see his collections. They also tried to see the Curator Miller collections, but it was then on exhibition tour to Switzerland and Germany, and they probably could not see the collection. Next, please. After the tour of the Curator Miller collection abroad, it came back to The Hague, and there another Van Gogh exhibition was held. For this exhibition, Helene Curator Miller made a visitor's book. It contains signatures of many Dutch visitors, as well as German, French, British, Austrian, US, Japanese, and even Egyptian and Australian visitors. Next, please. In 1935, Magosaburo Ohara was one of the most important collectors of Western art. Most of the works were collected in the 1920s, but there was no Van Gogh in the collection, so they looked for Van Goghs. They contacted De La Faye and were offered 2 Van Goghs from him. One of the 2 was a poplar trees with Alpio in the background. This was one of the Otto Wacker paintings, and it was then in the possession of De La Faye. Neither Ohara nor his advisor Shikiba did not know at the time about the Wacker trials in Berlin. The painting was bought by Ohara for 18,000 guilders with a sort of certificate of authenticity by De La Faye. Ohara Museum was delighted and the painting was exhibited in the museum. Frankly, this was the first original Van Gogh painting I saw in my life in 1975. Of course, it was shown then as an authentic Van Gogh. I, as an 18-year-old boy, future art historian and Van Gogh scholar, had no doubt about the painting. I was deeply moved by the painting, but 1 year later, I read in a publication that it would have been one of the Otto Wacker forgeries. Naturally, I was embarrassed, but it was the first good lesson for an art history student. A few years after the purchase of the Wacker Van Gogh came the World War II. 6 years, and next please. This is one in Cleveland on the right. The autoworker must have painted this based on this Cleveland painting. Next, please. 6 years after the war, 1951, was the restart of the Van Gogh enthusiasm in Japan. The biographical drama Man of Flames was a great hit, and a Japanese translation of Irving Stone's Lustful Life was also published in the same year. Next, please. 1953 was a centenary year of Van Gogh's birth. In Japan, an exhibition of reproductions of Van Gogh's works were held in a bookstore hall. There was no single original work, only reproductions. But the hall and the street before the bookstore were full with visitors. Next, please. In 1956 and 57, the Hollywood film Lustful Life was shown in Japan as well, with a special recommendation by the Ministry of Science and Education, which is very exceptional. Next, please. 1958, the first Van Gogh exhibition was held in Tokyo and Kyoto. In this year, the Curator collection came to Japan, and the Van Gogh family collection came to the United States West Coast. At the same time, 2 exhibitions were held on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. In Japan as well as in the United States, it was naturally a sensational blockbuster show. Next, please. This is the opening of the show in Japan. Next, please. This is director Hamacher in Japan. Next, please. 1978. Bank of Hiroshima bought the Garden of Daubeny for 690 million yen. It was in Kramarski collection in New York for about 40 years. And before Kramarski, it was in the National Gallery in Berlin, which had bought the painting in 1929 for 240,000 Deutsche Mark. Then came the time of the Japanese bubble economy. Next, please. This is, the original frames. Yes, next, please. Then came the time of the Japanese bubble economy, 1987. Yasuda Fire and Marine Insurance bought sunflowers for about $40 million, the auction record price at the time. And in 1990, Ryoe Saito bought the portrait of Dr. Gachet for $82.5 million. Next, please. This was also from the Kramarski collection, and before that, it was in the Städel collection in Frankfurt. Next, please. When we look at the exchange rate of the US dollar and Japanese yen in the past 50 years, the major Van Gogh paintings now in Japanese collections were all purchased from the United States when yen was strong against US dollars. After the Japanese bubble economy in the late 1980s and 1990s, we see exhibitions of Van Gogh or with some Van Goghs at least every 2 or 3 years. Next, please. And of course, the Detroit self-portrait was also there in 2016. Next, please. The most recent news, which was reported just last month, was a lawsuit by the heirs of the Paul von Mendelssohn Bartholdy for the restitution of the Song of Sunflowers. They seek the return of the painting or payment of the fair market value, in addition to the 750 million in punitive damages. I'm not a specialist of a lawsuit, but I'm just hoping that this will end up with a favorable compromise with mutual benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tsukasa, and thank you everyone for these insightful, informative and fascinating presentations. We are approaching our time limit, but we were open for discussion and Q&A session now. As we wait for questions from the audience, I would like to start by asking our panelists whether anything that we've just heard provoked any immediate reactions or responses.
I mean, I'll start. I think it's amazing. You know, we've had a number of these exhibitions about reception in recent years, and I think it's interesting. I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I think it's interesting, you know, what the curators on this panel have done. Personally, I wasn't able to really sort of grasp the contemporary, modern and contemporary response to Van Gogh's art in the United States because it was just too big. It was too big of a topic and could have been an exhibition in and of itself. And I just wonder from my colleagues who have curated exhibitions on the reception if you might tell us a little bit about your methodology and sort of the thinking behind the scope of your projects.
You mean when it comes to the reception of the reaction of contemporary artists to Van Gogh? Well, for us, for the German reception, first of all, you have to ask the question whether it's only Van Gogh who is the role model for the painters, or as in Germany, there's so many other artists like Gauguin, Cézanne, Seurat, Signac. They were all shown in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century in numerous exhibitions. And it's really difficult to really pinpoint if it's just the Van Gogh influence. And then when you think, okay, it is Van Gogh, he is the main influence in the back, then you would still have to find out which Van Gogh, because Van Gogh changed his style so much, and the style for some artists, some loved his heavy impasto and structured works, and other ones loved his more cloisonné and flat scenes. So that's what we tried in our exhibition, to kind of separate the different Van Goghs, the heavy impasto Van Gogh, the more formal Van Gogh, the drawings of Van Gogh, and to really put that into different segments and say, well, Van Gogh was such a heavy influence on the German art scene because his style was like offered a variety so that many artists could find something they would appreciate in his work.
One of the common things that really interests me was yellow. That was one, and as you say, there's these different responses where artists were looking for their own preoccupations, but there was this continuity of responding to yellow all the way through, particularly with the sunflowers. And
well, I'm afraid
heritage. He actually said that was the biggest influence Van Gogh had on him. It gave him, quote unquote, courage with yellow, which is just a really lovely way of putting it.
Tsukasa, would you like to share any reflection on what the response in Japan means for our understanding of the nature of modernism in that cultural setting?
Well, in Japan, Van Gogh is very, very popular because first it was reaction came from the novelists and poets because of a tragic life, and the first came the letters. Long ago, Roberto Jensen read a paper in Japan about velocity and the speed of the diffusion of reputation of Cézanne and Van Gogh, and he compared the reputation of diffusion of Cézanne and Van Gogh, and the reputation of Van Gogh went faster than Cézanne because the translations of letters was faster than the exhibitions and visual transmission in those days. So, so first came the reaction by the literature, and then came the artists. But in Japan, the reaction by literature was more important than artists. And moreover, Van Gogh was were intelligible artists for the Japanese, because they did not have Greek mythology knowledge and Krishna iconography, and so it's a simple and emotional reaction was easier for the Japanese. But I wanted to ask a question to Alex about the German reaction, because in an article by Ron Mannheim on the Germanic annexationist ideology in those days, that might have played important roles. And I'm just wondering why Van Gogh was so popular in Germany after 1900. It's more very, very popular there. And Ron Mannheim explains the situation with the word annexationist ideology, namely the Germanic painters, the concept of Germanic painters, which include Van Gogh, Rembrandt, and Munch, and even Hodler too. So this might have been one of the reasons why ideologically Van Gogh was accepted both by the right wing and the left wing ideologies. What do you think about this?
Well, with Van Gogh has sort of certain parts of the German art critics or artists were trying to Germanize Van Gogh, as they did in the 19th century before with Rembrandt. There was the famous publication Rembrandt als Erzieher, and Rembrandt became this. All of a sudden, he was a German painter and was taken away from the Dutch. And sort of same thing happened with Van Gogh, but only in like close circles where the German expressionists needed a role model, and they needed a role model which was not French, because there was so many after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, 1871. There were a lot of prejudices from the German side against the French, and taking inspiration from a French painter like Cézanne or Gogh was much more difficult to convey to the German public, rather than taking inspiration from a Dutch painter. And at the time, it was like Dutch and German seemed to be more familiar.
Well, Van Gogh was not, at least not French. So that was very important.
Yeah, and that was important. And that's why Paul Fechter, in his book Expressionism, which was published in 1914 and is one of the early surveys of the movement of Expressionism, he really called Van Gogh an anti-impressionist hero who would have more depth, metaphysical depth than the French art, and he considered French art to be superficial and German art sort of romantically deep. And this is a sort of very flat distinction, or even a prejudice distinction, that the French would only produce this very like superficial art, and that the Germans would feel art and would come to the core of what art should be. And in my slides, I showed the image of Max Beckmann, who paints himself, like oriented himself on an image by Van Gogh, and paints a self-portrait. He lets himself grow a beard, and he saw the 1905 exhibition in Amsterdam. And then he says, well, I'm now between Van Gogh and Cézanne, but I want to give more intellectual depth to my work, which those two don't have. So it's when you read text by German expressionists, they have this this idea of like taking inspiration but making it better in their art. And taking inspiration from France was difficult for a nation like Germany, who kind of had a large who were like opposed to the French nation at the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I should note that Chris Stolwijk had to leave, so he won't be able to join our discussion, but we are grateful for his contribution. And we received a lot of comments with expressions of gratitude and appreciation for the breadth and wealth of knowledge that was presented here. But would any of the panelists like to comment whether there are any additional areas of inquiry that you think are ready for further exploration or merit further attention? Perhaps Bregje, you would like to take this one to start.
Sure, thank you. Of course, I think that France merits much more attention than it has received. We've seen such beautiful projects and exhibitions from England, the United States, Germany, Japan, but I really feel that such a thing is lacking for France, maybe because it's been too large for a very long time to take on, or I don't know why this key publication on France is missing, but I hope, of course, in a couple of years' time, that maybe I can help a little bit with that. And I will also be focusing on contemporary artists, so the Fauve in my, for instance, in my PhD, I hope, because I really think it's very important to combine all of these things. And that's also what I very much like about these projects in England, for instance, or in Germany, that they so much combine these the reception of art dealers and museums buying pieces, but also what contemporary artists are doing. So hopefully.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to address this question?
I mean, I think I'll just offer up that, you know, in the United States and Dorota, you and I have been sort of unified on this front. We weren't able to dig into it fully, but it does seem as if, you know, there's this trend of women patrons being some of the first to embrace Van Gogh and to welcome him into their collections. And so while I wouldn't want to say it's a unilateral sort of trend, there does seem to be some sort of correlation between an artist like Van Gogh, who in the United States was a bit marginalized, and being embraced by patrons who were also not of, you know, that weren't of the white male collecting membership, I'll say. I don't know if that is the same trend in other countries, but I think that is ripe for discussion here in the United States.
Important figures in our exhibition were the Davies sisters, who were, you know, really early collectors of Van Gogh and responsible for some of the best Van Goghs we've got in our country.
Could I show some of the the maps I prepared and the graphs and maps?
We can bring the slides up.
Oh, like this. Okay. Well, these are the maps and the charts based on my databases of the exhibitions and museum acquisitions and sales prices. And this is number of Van Gogh shows in the world in the whole period. And during the war, there are, of course, decrease. But during the World War II, decrease not so much, because in the United States, there are quite a lot of exhibitions during the time. And the Great Depression, and also after the Van Gogh Foundation was made, it became more or less the public collections. Before that, it was a private collection, but so the number of exhibitions decreases. And after the opening of the Rijksmuseum Vincent van Gogh, the number of exhibitions decreased again. And after the privatizing of Van Gogh, the former national museums, Van Gogh Museum, the Gogh Museum, and they have to make fundraising, so the number of exhibitions increases quite a lot. Next, please. And this is the number of exhibitions of the 6 countries, and the US is the top. And in after 1900, Germany is number one. And then came the First World War. And once again, Germany became number one. But after the Nazi regime, it went down. United States became number one here. And during the World War II, in all the other countries, the number decreases, but only in the United States. There's so many exhibitions here because 14 Van Gogh's paintings are left in the United States, and they traveled quite a lot, more than 40 venues, I think, during the 5 years. So it's very, very interesting. And after the war, the number increases in all the other countries, only in the United States decreases. And the United States is always number one, except for two occasions. This is the centenary, 1953. So in the Netherlands became number one very shortly, briefly. And this is during the bubble economy in Japan. So it's a very brief number one for Japan, but US always had a position number one. Next, please. The interesting thing is that in the early phase, the Van Gogh's paintings went to the Scandinavian countries. It went to Germany, of course, but all the Scandinavian countries had at least one painting in the museums. Next, please. This is 1926 and 30. It becomes like this. This is exhibitions. Next, please. This is the Van Gogh's paintings in museums in 6 countries. This is the opening of the Curator Museum, and this is the opening of the Van Gogh Museum here, and the US. And the number 3 is Switzerland. This is interesting. Next, please. This is number of exhibitions the whole time. The remarkable thing is that of the blank areas, most of the Asian countries and African countries and Islamic countries, they're blank. So this is the colored areas is actually what we call the global art market. Next, please. This is in paintings in museums in 2020. And more blank areas in Africa and Islamic countries and Asian countries as well. Next, next, please. Oh, this is the prices of Van Gogh paintings in US dollar in the whole period. Well, after 1980, the price is extremely high. So it is as if nothing happened until 1950, but actually, this is a very strong, explosive increase of prices in 1920s here, actually. But this is just a part of the charts and the maps I used in my book, and I have some more. But just to give you an impression of the international charts of that.
Thank you, Tsukasa. We are awaiting the publication of your book. And unless there are any additional comments from the panel, I will conclude our discussion today by thanking again all the panelists and our audience for participation in this rich, informative, and thought-provoking exchange. We will continue our program in the evening at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, when we will host another panel discussion with 3 scholars from the Van Gogh Museum. They will consider and address myths surrounding the life and art of Vincent van Gogh. We invite you to participate in the program either in person at the DIA or online, and we hopefully we can put the link to the program in the comments section. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.